So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's live stream of Debunking Myths About the Lincoln Assassination Part 2. More than 6,000 people checked out our April 14th Facebook Live event in which we debunked some common myths about the Lincoln assassination, so we thought we'd do a second edition. Now, this time we're live streaming to not only our Facebook, but also to Twitter and YouTube channels. I'm the Associate Director of Visitor Experience, Colleen Pryor, and here today to help me separate fact from fiction is National Park Service Ranger Dave Byers.
Yeah, I'm a supervisor over at Forest Theater National Historic Site, and great to be with you, Colleen, and look forward to the conversation and debunking some of these myths.
Yes, indeed. All right. So on April 14th, 1865, 5 days after General Lee of the Confederate Army surrendered to General Grant of the United States Army, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was both a famous actor and also an avowed white supremacist. President Lincoln died the next morning on Saturday, April 15th at 7:22 a.m. John Wilkes Booth escaped from the theater, injuring his leg sometime during the night of the 14th on his escape. He was caught 12 days later hiding in a tobacco barn in Virginia. Now, Booth was supposed to be taken alive and put on trial, but he refused to surrender, and he was shot and killed on the scene. And Booth was not the only person involved in the assassination. He actually had a whole network of conspirators. 8 of his co-conspirators were tried and convicted, and 4 were executed. Now, we're going to talk about 3 common misconceptions today. First is where and how John Wilkes Booth broke his leg. We're also going to talk about the innocence of, or lack thereof, of one of his co-conspirators, Mary Surratt. And we're also going to discuss the question of whether or not Lincoln knew he was going to die before he was shot. Now, if you have questions along the way, please feel free, to throw them in the comment section of whatever platform you're using. We'll either answer them during the live stream or we'll respond after the program is over. So the first myth that we're going to talk about is actually less of a myth and more of a debate, and that is where and how did John Wilkes Booth break his leg? We know that he broke his fibula, a small bone above the left ankle, sometime on the night of April 14th, and that the broken bone was set by Dr. Samuel Mudd sometime later that night. Some people think he broke it when he jumped out of the presidential box after shooting Lincoln. Lincoln was seated on the balcony level of the theater. Booth jumped about 12 feet down onto the stage and then escaped out the backstage door. So some people think he broke it jumping to the stage. Others think his horse fell on him during his escape. So Dave and I are going to do a little bit of a debate here. I'm first going to present the case, the evidence for Booth breaking his leg as on the escape, not on the stage, but after he left the theater. And then Dave is going to rebut with the evidence that maybe he did break it at the theater.
Yes.
So
and you can be the judge out there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Kind of, spoiler alert, we really don't know. So this is kind of up to you to decide which argument you find more convincing. Now, scholar Michael Kaufman is the one who popularized the idea that Booth may in fact not have broken his leg on the stage. Before Kaufman introduced this theory, it was pretty widely believed that that's what happened. However, Kaufman gives the following evidence. First of all, there are no witness statements from the night of April 14th from people who were in the theater, witnessed the assassination, and saw Booth jumping onto the stage. There are no witness statements from those people that survived which mention any injury or limp. The only person whose words we have from the theater that night who said that Booth broke his leg on the stage is Booth himself, and I will get to that in a moment. Now, there were a lot of people who weren't interviewed, so it's certainly possible that somebody did see him limp or get injured, but we don't have any evidence, any surviving witness statements that night. Now, the actor who was on stage, his name was Harry Hawk, he said that he did see Booth land on all fours, and there are some other witnesses who saw him kind of land badly, but then he's described as standing up and running across the stage full speed. No mention of a limp, an injury, no mention that I've seen of a look of pain on his face, nothing like that. Now, it's entirely possible. I see the immediate rebuttal here that maybe he was running on adrenaline and didn't feel the pain right away. I'm willing to accept that much. However, what we also know is that after Booth ran out of the theater, full speed, both legs running out of the theater, He went out the backstage door where there was a man who worked for the theater, commonly known as Peanuts. His name was Joseph Burroughs. Peanuts was holding Booth's horse, and there was no mounting block for Booth to get on the horse. So, and this was a large horse. We know it was a large gray bay mare that he was riding. And this mare was known to be really skittish and really jerky, kind of ran really rough. And so when Booth runs out, there's no mounting block. He manages to pull himself up onto the horse using just kind of his arms and his adrenaline and his ankle muscle. Totally possible. He put his right foot in the stirrup and got onto the horse. But it's a pretty big feat of strength for somebody who may have had a broken leg at the time. Not only that, but then Peanuts went to give Booth the reins to the horse. And instead of just grabbing the reins from him, Booth took the butt of a knife that he had been holding and he hit Burroughs over the head, and then he kicked Burroughs. And that's something that I find really interesting if he was injured. Not only did he launch himself up onto the horse, he would have had to have one foot in the stirrup. In order to kick Burroughs, he would have had to take his good foot out of the stirrup and then kick him with that, or kick him with his bad leg. So I'm unconvinced that he was injured at that point. We also know that Booth crossed into Maryland from DC at the Navy Yard Bridge. The sentry on duty, when he gave his witness statement to the police, didn't mention anything about an injury or a limp or anything of the kind. And again, as I said before, Booth's horse, this gray bay mare that multiple witnesses saw him riding, was well known to be skittish. I think I saw something, Booth even said that the horse kicked and bucked so much that he was in danger of getting kicked by the horse's hind legs because it bucked so much. But Booth was very proud of his riding ability. He knew that he was able to ride a rough horse. He was able to tame it. And so he had no problem with the idea that he was riding such a rough horse. But we do know that when Booth arrived at Dr. Mudd's house late that night, Booth had a broken ankle and he was no longer riding the mare. He and his co-conspirator, David Harold, who was on the run with him, had switched horses. And Booth was now riding a much calmer horse that David Harold had originally brought. And this horse was known to not jostle a whole lot. And the bay mare that Harold was now riding had a swollen shoulder and scrapes that were consistent with a fall. Kaufman has also pointed out that the injury on Booth's ankle is a very common equestrian injury that is frequently seen when a horse falls and then rolls over the rider's ankle. It's not a particularly common injury that comes from blunt force trauma like dropping from a 12-foot height. Now, as I said, Booth's diary, Booth himself did say that he broke it on the stage. His diary, which we have on display at the Ford's Theater Museum, mentions how he broke it, and I'm quoting, "I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted sic semper before I fired. In jumping, broke my leg. I passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump." Now, this sounds pretty clear. In jumping, I broke my leg. But almost every other aspect of this paragraph has been disregarded by historians. He said, I was stopped, but I pushed on. We know that he was not stopped. He said that a colonel was at Lincoln's side. There was not. Major Henry Rathbone was there, clearly wearing the insignia of his rank. He said he shouted sic semper before he fired. He didn't. He shouted that after he shot the president. So there's a lot of facts here that may not totally be right. And it's seen as self-aggrandizement. So that is my argument that Booth may not have broken his leg on the stage. Dave, you want to rebut me?
Well, that's a pretty good argument. A lot of great points in there. I'll start where you ended, which is with Booth's own account. And there are a lot of things that Booth writes that self-aggrandizing certainly could apply, and it may apply here. But a couple of the criticisms I think maybe are not entirely justified. Things like, Major Rathbone was a major, not a colonel. I'm not sure how much time Booth had to let me just think about the insignia first before I fire this shot. Some accounts do have Booth stopping to talk with possibly Charles Forbes before the box and presenting a card to him of some sort. Is that what he means by stop? He talks about the bone tearing at his flesh, and though it wasn't an open fracture, it certainly could have felt like that, right? So, there are a number of elements that you could see as a challenge, but there's nothing about it that says, oh, we should dismiss all of that. And I think that's true just generally, right? I mean, ultimately, as you said, we don't know, but for either side, there's nothing that sort of disproves the alternate plausible possibility. A couple of things, and you know, certainly, as you pointed out, all the witnesses there in the theater, all the witnesses we know about, talked about Booth running with lightning speed, rushing across the stage, striding, springing to his feet, all things that you wouldn't think necessarily could be done if somebody had broken their leg. But we think about Booth. Booth is tremendously athletic. It's one of his sort of trademarks as an actor. He would jump onto the stage during Macbeth. We also know that he had a fairly high threshold for pain. He had been injured numerous times on the stage, but continued to play on. Had held up well during a surgery from like a really awful kind of neck tumor that he had removed. So the idea that adrenaline and perhaps alcohol from earlier in the day was at work and sort of saw him through that, I find plausible. Also that nobody necessarily noticed a wince of pain, you know, as they were trying to take stock of the situation seems possible to me. Numerous doctors have said that, yeah, you can break a fibula, which is not a weight-bearing bone, and still continue on. Many people do that, not having realized they even broke it until later when it begins to swell and they begin to have some pain. Great case in point for this, the 2012 Olympics, one of the runners in the relay broke his fibula at the 200-meter mark and continued on the rest of the 200 meters for the 400-meter, still put in a near world record time, right? And only realized later that he had broken the fibula. So I think it seems plausible to me. By the time, you know, and I think the same is true for his actions in the alley, you know, all that adrenaline, whatever, and however, I'm intrigued by the kick too, right? If it was injured and he was feeling it, he probably wouldn't have done that, but I don't know that he necessarily would have been feeling it. By the time he gets to the Navy Yard Bridge, Silas Cobb, who is out there, lets him pass. He's under orders not to do that. Security had been lax. It was not uncommon for that to happen, but he had let the president's assassin get across the bridge. It's really not in Silas Cobb's best interest to say, yeah, he was acting funny and he was all injured, and I'm not sure what was up with that. You know, so it does make you wonder about Cobb's testimony. But also, Booth is an actor, and he has something to hide, and he needs to get across this bridge. It doesn't serve him to not, like, let me suck it up and look like nothing's wrong for just a bit. So again, it's not. It doesn't tell us anything for sure, but I think it suggests a plausible alternative. The accounts of Booth's horse rolling on him. So there are several accounts that come from David Harold and also from John Lloyd at Surratt's tavern, both of whom have their own reasons to not necessarily be telling the truth. Samuel Mudd would also relay the same account. Certainly, if Samuel Mudd is trying to say, I'm innocent of anything, he's not going to say, well, yeah, no, he came in and told me he jumped it on the stage. You know, he broke it on the jump to the stage. The most interesting thing, I think, is that a lot of Kaufman's argument is about, you know, nobody knew or thought about Booth breaking his leg on the stage until Booth's diary came to light later. And that only is public in 1867. There's a testimony from an investigator out in the field named William Wood, who on April 23rd, before Booth is caught and cornered, he writes a letter saying there's no doubt but that Booth broke one of the bones in his leg in the jump on the stage, and later writes about, you know, again, reasserting that same belief. There's another passage from a Major John Waite that essentially says the same thing. Booth fractured a bone of his leg in jumping upon the stage, not by falling near Bryantown. It suggests that somehow, somewhere, there's evidence out there to suggest that, yeah, we know about the horse story, but we've discounted it for some reason. Now, we don't know why, but we know that they're doing that. There's also a later account from Thomas Jones, who had hid Booth for 4 days, and probably was the closest relationship Booth had to any outside figure, who also recognizes the cover story of the horse, but that it was really the stage jump. So all of that, the Wood letters, the Jones testimony, and the fact that it's still plausible, I come down a little bit on the side of the stage break.
And I see the plausibility of your argument. I come down a little bit on the side of the horse break. So we leave it to you all to decide which argument you find more convincing.
Right.
Sorry, Dave, did you have anything else to add?
Oh, I was just saying, and just like historians out there, we've spent a lot of time talking about that question. It seems to be an endlessly fascinating, although a bit trivial, you know, question that ultimately doesn't matter, but is a really interesting aspect that people argue endlessly about.
It's something we get asked about on site all the time. And it is interesting how trivial this is, but it kind of makes or breaks the drama of the story in a lot of ways for some people, I think. And so it's interesting how opinionated people can get on this. And the truth of the matter is we're probably never going to know unless some other evidence
barring some additional, evidence that crops up there.
Yep. Exactly.
Which it does from time to time. So.
Sometimes it does. So who knows? We'll let you know if we see something.
Okay.
So if you're just joining us, welcome. We're here debunking some common myths about the Abraham Lincoln assassination. And the second one that I'm going to talk about is the question of whether or not Mary Surratt was innocent. Now, Mary Surratt was a co-conspirator of John Wilkes Booth's. She was a middle-aged widow. She had adult children. She was executed for conspiracy along with 3 other of Booth's co-conspirators. And there is some controversy over her execution, both now and at the time. Now, the question is, does this controversy over the fact that she was executed mean she was innocent? Or does it mean that she wasn't innocent, but maybe should not have been executed? Somewhere in between? There's a lot of discussion about this. So I'm just going to present what we know factually with evidence. We know Mary Surratt was absolutely a Confederate sympathizer. She had lived in Maryland and then moved to Washington in the years leading up to the assassination, so during the Civil War. She and her family had enslaved people before slavery was outlawed in Maryland. Her son, John Surratt, was a Confederate courier. He carried messages between Washington and Canada, which was kind of a hotbed of Confederate spy activity at the time, hiding in the woods in Canada and such. We know that her son, John, introduced Mary, his mother, to John Wilkes Booth. Mary was living in Washington just a few blocks away from the theater in a boarding house. And because she ran a boarding house, she didn't have a lot of privacy. There were people renting rooms out of the house who ended up testifying as witnesses in the trial of the conspirators. And one of the witnesses, Lewis Weichman, gave quite a bit of information on this. He saw Booth coming to visit Mary multiple times at her house on H Street. Sometimes he would bring other co-conspirators with him. Sometimes he would come alone. He and Mary were said to often lock themselves away and talk at length, just the two of them. Now, Mary also owned a tavern out in Maryland. As Dave pointed out, there was John Lloyd, who was a man who didn't own. He ran the tavern that Mary Surratt owned on her behalf. So the month before the assassination, March of 1865, Mary's son, John, I apologize, there's a lot of Johns in the story. Mary's son, John Surratt, delivered some guns to John Lloyd, the tavern keeper out in Maryland. And he told Lloyd to just keep the guns. Someone's going to come get them. We'll tell you what to do with them. The day of the assassination, April 14th, John Wilkes Booth paid a visit to Mary Surratt at her boarding house. Now, no one heard their conversation, as far as I know. Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but Lewis Weichman, remember the boarder who lived in Mary Surratt's house, then testified that right after John Wilkes Booth left the house, Weichman accompanied Mary out to the tavern, out to Maryland, where Mary went to speak with John Lloyd. Lloyd was not there, so they waited until he came home. Mary had a small package with her, and when Lloyd came home, she gave him the package and said to have these shooting irons ready because somebody would come get them that night. And it turned out that package contained a pair of field glasses, excuse me, some field glasses. So
goggles and a mask and gloves.
So yes, field glasses. She said, get the shooting irons ready. Here's some field glasses. People are going to come get them tonight. Now, later, after the assassination, the police were at Mary's boarding house in Washington questioning her. And Lewis Powell, who was one of the other co-conspirators, showed up in the middle of the police investigation late at night. And when the police asked him what he was doing there, he said Mary had hired him to dig a ditch. Mary said she had no idea who he was, even though there was witness testimony that said that they had met previously at the house. She did know who he was. So that's what we know. She knew that Booth was going to be stopping in Maryland the night of the 14th. She knew he would need guns. She knew he would need field glasses. And she lied to the police about knowing Lewis Powell. That is what we know, certainly beyond the shadow of a doubt. Now, she was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to death. And the death sentence was handed down just the day before the execution. So there wasn't even a full 24 hours, I don't think, for her lawyers to do anything about this. However, 5 of the 9 commissioners who found her guilty wrote a letter to President Johnson asking that her sentence be downgraded to life in prison. Now, this wasn't due to her innocence, but rather because of her age and her sex. The US federal government had never executed a woman before. In addition, Mary's daughter, Anna, her adult daughter, went to the White House to see Johnson along with some of Mary's supporters, but Johnson would not see her. Mary's lawyer even got a last-minute writ of habeas corpus ordering Mary to be handed over to a civilian court rather than abide by the sentence of the military tribunal. But President Johnson suspended the writ the morning of the execution, and Mary was hanged with the other 3 conspirators. President Johnson said that all of the appeals that had come to him had been due to her age and sex, and he didn't want to set a precedent that crimes committed by women were less punishable than crimes committed by men. So the question of her guilt and whether she deserved to die is really up to you. I mean, we know she did not physically hurt anybody else. She did not shoot anyone. She didn't stab anyone. But she knew Booth. She was a Confederate sympathizer. She aided and abetted Booth. She likely knew about the assassination plan and did not turn him in. She also lied to the police when she said she didn't know Lewis Powell. So she was certainly guilty of something. Whether that deserves the death penalty, either then or now, is a matter of individual opinion. So, Dave, anything you want to throw in on that one?
Yeah, I agree. The question of was it a miscarriage of justice, her execution, is a kind of different question from was she guilty of something. And I think the evidence does suggest she's certainly guilty of something. I find it very credible to imagine that she would have known about earlier kidnapping plots regarding the president. All of these conspirators are circulating in her boarding house. The trips out to Surrattsville with the shooting irons are pretty damning. Later in the 1970s, some new evidence came to light about George Surratt, who had been supposed, the intent for him was to attack Andrew Johnson. He never went through with it, but also hanged alongside Mary. He had written about how Booth had told him that Mary was going out to Surrattsville to provide the field glasses and ensure the shooting irons were ready. Really no reason for him to say that. Doesn't help his case, doesn't hurt his case, and that's tucked away and then comes up in 1970. So evidence still is coming out that suggests that she understood what was something was up, and if she didn't know the specifics of it, she certainly should have. Whether that justifies executing her, I kind of think not. I think if you look at the conspirators and what they ended up with at the end, I think of her guilt as something, sort of less than Samuel Mudd. And so he got imprisonment. And so it seems like that would be a more justifiable, punishment. Ultimately, though, at the time, conspiracy, the way the conspiracy laws are written, if you conspire, you can be treated as if you committed the crime that you conspire to do. So by that measure, if she's part of a conspiracy to, I don't know what the punishment for kidnapping the president would be, or murdering the president, then that might have been justifiable punishment.
Yeah.
Another one of those things where just barring some additional information, what's out there is very suggestive, but we're not going to know, for sure.
Exactly. Before we get to our last question, just welcome to anyone who has joined us midway through. We are debunking some common myths associated with the Lincoln assassination, and I'm going to hand it over to Dave to take the last myth.
All right, so our last question is about, did Lincoln know he was going to die? And the answer is yes. A spoiler alert, it's the end of us all, right? But did he know he was going to die as president? And there are kind of two ways of thinking about this. And often people ask this in the sense that, did Lincoln have a premonition of his death? And there are a lot of instances that people, thinking back decades later, identified as sort of suggestive to them that Lincoln had this premonition of his own death. Two of them I'll just mention because they're the ones that are often heard about. One is his one of the Metropolitan Police officers that is helping to guard him at the White House, William Crook, who ends up being, I think, a friend to Lincoln as well. He talks about how every night he would say, "Good night, Crook," and then on April 14th says, "Goodbye, Crook." Right, and so as some kind of indication that Lincoln knew that something was up. Interesting story. It's satisfying in a narrative sense. Crook writes that in 1910, some 45 years after the event. And though this is oft-cited, what they don't usually include is the very next line that he wrote, which is, of course, it's possible I may have been mistaken. So, yeah, why does he write that, 45 years later, unless he really thought he might have been mistaken? The other often cited example is the dream that Lincoln has in the days just before the assassination. He's alleged to have had a dream where he wakes up in the White House, wanders through the White House, hears mourning and wailing, gets to the East Room, sees a body laid out there and asks who is dead at the White House. The answer from the mourners and the soldiers is, it's the president. He was shot by an assassin. So that's a story that's related by Ward Hill Lemon, who is Lincoln's kind of self-appointed bodyguard. Unfortunately, he's in Richmond at the time the assassination takes place. He writes that in the 1880s. Also later in the account, Lemon writes that, but Lincoln did tell him later that it wasn't him who was laying there, it was some other president. But even so, it's a story that is a very satisfying kind of narrative arc. It sets up this sort of, there's a fate, and forces converging, and Lincoln understood what was happening. It was kind of inevitable. But it's really hard to know what to do with that, right? Ultimately, we don't know what Lincoln thought, right? And we can't know as historians unless we had evidence from Lincoln. What we do know, though, is the other part of this question, which is, does Lincoln understand the danger that he's in? And he certainly does. Lincoln maintains a folder labeled Assassinations, an envelope full of something like 80 to 100 death threats that he had gotten as president, threatening death by poison ink, by sending him a spider-filled dumpling, all kinds of things, some of them very, very venomous, as a spider might be. There are newspaper accounts that openly talk about assassinating the president, about offering money for assassinating the president. And so he's very aware of the idea that his life is absolutely in danger. And it starts from the very beginning on his way into the inauguration in 1861. And Colleen, I think, is it the Knights of the Golden Circle that are involved in that plot?
That's correct. Yeah, the Baltimore chapter of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Yeah.
And it was, there was a plan to actually assassinate Lincoln as he traveled through Baltimore on his way to Washington for his inauguration. And but Detective Pinkerton, who was a very well-known detective at the time, had spies in the Knights of the Golden Circle, and he managed to get Lincoln on a different train coming through Baltimore 9 hours before he was supposed to. But I mean, that was an extremely credible threat, credible to the point that we even focus on it in a portion of the museum at Fort.
Right, in the museum. Yep. So Lincoln humorously, when asked about whether he feared assassination, he would say that Hannibal Hamlin, his vice president, was his best life insurance policy. Hamlin is far more abolitionist than he is, far more radical. And so Lincoln sort of thought, who would kill me? Because you'd end up with Hannibal Hamlin. Of course, that changes when in his second term he has Andrew Johnson. Lincoln overall was pretty fatalistic about whether anybody was going to get to him. I'll read just a quote from Noah Brooks, one of his good friends, a journalist who Lincoln said, "I long ago made up my mind that if anybody wants to kill me, he will do it. There are 1,000 ways of getting at a man if it's desirable that he should be killed." Lincoln, I think, just recognized the danger, but he also saw that his primary role was doing the things he needed to do as a president, going the places that he needed to go, opening up the White House and talking to the endless stream of people that would come there. He understood that he was opening himself up to possible harm, but really didn't see any way of accomplishing the job that he had to do, that he saw as really his sacred responsibility, without opening himself up to those dangers. He only reluctantly allowed protective details to start serving at the White House in late 1864. He would go out, and he's still the only president who's been under fire, right, out at Fort Stevens in the 1864. And so I think he very much understood that there was a lot of danger out there, and then acknowledged that he might lose his life and not survive his presidency. But that was, the cost of him doing the job that he was there to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on, and that we are historians. Our job is to look at the facts that are in front of us, and the fact is, none of us were inside Lincoln's head, so we only have the evidence of the letters that he kept with assassination threats. We have the evidence of Pinkerton with the Baltimore plot. We don't have evidence that he had a dream. That's just something
right.
we can't validate either way. Yeah.
One just other quick incident in 1864, he's traveling to the soldiers' home just outside of D.C., as he often did, and heard a gunshot, and his horse bolted and went up the hill. He lost his hat. Soldiers from the soldiers' home later found the hat, and there was a bullet hole that was through it. Probably an assassination attempt. Lincoln played it off and said, "No, I can't imagine anybody would want to assassinate me. It's just not a thing we do in America." It must have been a hunter coming home from somewhere. Whether he really thought that, whether he was just making himself feel better, hard to know. But it's just one other account of him sort of dismissing the extreme danger that he was in from the moment he took office to the moment that he died.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's just about time for us to sign off. But before we do, Dave, I think you've got a couple virtual events coming up at the Park Service.
I just, as we're all in virtual mode, just asking folks to tune in to our Facebook page on for Ford's Theater National Historic Site. If you look at that on Facebook, type in Ford's Theater, you'll see two of them there. One has a Lincoln head, that's the Ford's Theater Society. And then there's the arrowhead, so two heads, and that's the National Park site. So tune into both of those. We're also part of the National Mall and Memorial Parks. A lot of things going on that Facebook account too, including a lot of special things coming up for Memorial Day weekend. So just tune into the National Malls account and also to the Ford's Theater accounts.
Yep, and we also have another Facebook Live event coming up, another live stream event. We have an interview with historian James Swanson, the author of the book Manhunt, which is a very popularly read book about the Lincoln assassination. That's going to be on May 20th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And Ford's Theater Society Director Paul Tatro is going to interview historian James Swanson as part of a new series titled Cabinet Conversations, Creativity, History, and Leadership. Swanson will discuss when his interest in Lincoln began and his journey to write Manhunt, the 12-day chase for Lincoln's killer. So please be sure to tune in for that. Thank you so much for joining us. And be safe, be well, and we'll see you next time.
All right. That's great. Thank you all.